Hello, good afternoon if you're just joining us here at LBC. We spent the last hour talking about two particular British jihadis and their return probably to America. It could have been to the UK, but it looks likely to be America. What about the so-called jihadi brides or the IS widows if their husbands have been killed in the fighting? But we've got such mixed views about women in these situations, I think, and certainly girls, because obviously the aspect of them still being children comes into play. But just recently, a Baghdad court sentenced 10 widows of Islamic State terrorists who it sentenced them to life imprisonment. One was sentenced to death, even though her defence argued that she was sent to Iraq by her husband under duress. Another said that her child, or that the abduction of her child was threatened if she didn't do as she was told. So it certainly looks in some cases as though coercion and domestic abuse takes place. Going back to the argument about sex slavery, I'm sure that doesn't make for good relations, does it? That particular part of their belief system. But the reality is that these women are adults. When they're adult women, it is a different case, isn't it? Because that they are made to explain themselves in a way that perhaps younger children, girls and boys, wouldn't be expected to. And you remember the school girls from Bethnal Green, Kadima Sultana, Amira Abbasi and Shamima Begum, who they became, that footage of them in, I think it was in an Istanbul bus shelter, wasn't it, in the snow with their huge great bags. They'd gone to join Islamic State in Syria. We know that one of them is now dead, Kadima Sultana. We don't know much about the fate of the other two, but we do know that they were just 15 when they went. They followed a girl from their school who then arguably radicalised them into going, Shamina Begum, who was 15 when she went. She was the first from that school to flee to Syria, and there was, and perhaps still is, a concerted efforts to radicalise girls in schools. So it's always a shock, isn't it, when you see a girl or a woman involved in this kind of thing. But make no mistake, they are involved in this kind of thing. This report today from King's College London that suggests that the numbers of returning female British jihadis returning to our shores, returning to the UK, perhaps already returned to the UK, is larger than we first suspected, and we could still be significantly underestimating what they are capable of doing. What do we do about them? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. And are we instinctively just softer on women in these circumstances? Gina Vale joins me, Research Fellow at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College, co-author of this report I mentioned a moment ago. Gina, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me, and great to speak to you about this.
You too. Tell us a bit more about what you found then.
Well, we surveyed 80 countries for which data was available for men, women and minors who had travelled to or were born into, in the case of infants, the Islamic State just in their Levantine territory in Iraq and Syria. From what we found, based on previous estimates, women were looking at about 10% of the total affiliates. However, from our data, we're seeing that women constitute about 13%. And together with minors, women and minors constitute 1 in 4, or 25% of the total affiliates from foreign countries inside Iraq and Syria. And this is just from data that we had available. In fact, for women and minors, the data that we had was only for half or less than half of the 80 countries that we looked at. So we're still seeing great data shortages that we have available for women and minors. And this leads us to assume that we are looking at vast underestimates of those who have travelled to Islamic State.
And when you talk about data shortages, do you mean just numbers, or do you mean detail behind those numbers? Like, for example, have they gone back to their home country? Were they charged with anything in Turkey and Syria? Were they dealt with judicially in Iraq? Is it more than just the numbers of them that exist that you're looking at?
It's both. So we're looking at data shortages in terms of numbers. For Western Europe in particular, we're seeing women at about 17% of the total that have gone. And that's roughly consistent with the numbers that we're expecting. However, in regions such as the Middle East and North Africa, where we have over 18,800 affiliates that we have documented, we're only seeing 6% of women and 2% of minors. So this is a shortage in publicly available data that has been issued either by government sources or trusted, credible institutions or local media. We're also looking at a case of unknowns in terms of the data that we can get, especially for those after the fall of the so-called caliphate, whether that's women who have returned. We're seeing very low numbers of women who have returned and actually slightly higher for minors. But in the case of the UK, we're only seeing 2 documented cases of women who have returned to the United Kingdom. And that is purely cases that have been individual reports compiled by myself and my co-researcher, rather than official government data.
Because we know very little from the government on this. And obviously we can understand to some degree why that is. We'll hear from Lord Carlisle after 2:30, actually, former reviewer of terrorism legislation, who can shed a bit more light on that for us. But the 2 that you found, was that literally through your own investigations?
Correct. So this is looking through, we looked through over 90,500 pieces of data, and this is what was compiled to form the data set. But the 2 cases that we're looking at for the United Kingdom were only individual reports of 2 women that were reported to have come back to the UK.
Adult women?
Yes, adult women. Very, very limited detail is available. What we try to stress in this report is, for adults, we're looking at the legal age of consent, so 18 and above. But for minors, we need to look at more nuanced subcategorization in order to understand their roles and how they may have been motivated to become involved in the group, and therefore looking at their accountability going forward.
And the 2 women that you did find, is that all you can tell us about them? Can you tell us where they were from in this country? Can you tell us what they got up to when they were with Islamic State? Can you tell us where they are now?
We cannot give information on location. However, both women came back in a company of children. 1 child was taken and returned, but for the other woman, I apologise, there was at least 1 child that was born under Islamic State territory.
When you say taken and returned, what do you mean? 1 child was taken and returned? Taken by social services?
No, as in the mother gave birth to the child in the UK. The mother and child
was taken abroad, I see. Apologies, yeah.
Iraq and Syria, and then returned together. But for the other case, we're seeing a child that was born under Islamic State in Iraq and Syria and then returned to the UK.
Were you able to glean any information about levels of domestic abuse and coercion? Because that is often the defence that these women put forward when they end up in front of a court of some sort.
I think there's been great generalisation and stereotyping when it comes to women's involvement in terrorist organisations and extremist groups, not just Islamic State. The trope of jihadi bride is quite a simplistic one and is based on stereotypes of women lacking agency and choice in their own involvement. In terms of drivers for their engagement with the group and engagement with their ideology, we're seeing women who have ideological commitment. They're also being involved and recruited through social factors, so relations with their own personal or professional networks.
Which looks to have been the case with the Bethnal Green girls, doesn't it? That it was their friendship group that decided this was a good idea.
Correct. But with the case of the Bethnal Green girls, we need to make sure that we account for these girls as minors. They were 15 and 16 when travelling and not women. But for some countries... But
we don't know what happened to the 2 that haven't been reported dead, do we?
No, correct. So this is where we're looking at the unknowns within the conflict zone. We know that women, due to stereotypes of them being more passive, can travel undetected or with less suspicion than men through borders. So it may be that women have travelled to third-party countries or conflict zones without detection. It may be that women have been deported to other countries without knowing. We have cases of women and children who have been deported to countries such as Malaysia, where there is a zero visa agreement with Turkey. And in some cases, these women have been deported without their original country of origin knowing. We also have women who may have chosen to remain in the conflict zone. We know that 43% of all French citizens who are remaining in the conflict zone are women. And the 4% of returnees of women are showing that a vast number are either remaining inside the conflict zone or unaccounted for.
So would you say that on two fronts, that the lack of data tells us that we don't know the scale of the threat, and the lack of detail on the individuals that we do know about tells us that we don't know the scale of this threat, potential threat?
I think it shows that we don't know the scale of a potential threat if some women were still harbouring commitment to ISIS's ideology. However, it also shows that women and minors have been underestimated in states' considerations of threat assessment, targeting, etc., up until now. In a lot of figures that have been quoted, we're seeing totals for general affiliates, and we're also seeing a focus on foreign fighters, which predominantly focus on combatants and males.
Well, and we also know, don't we, that given the large-scale military defeat in places like Raqqa and Mosul, that the word has gone out to attack where you can, whether that's in the Middle East or here.
Correct. And this is where we're seeing women and minors taking a more violent role in support of the organisation. In February this year, we saw first video footage of women as frontline combatants. And in March this year, we were seeing propaganda, official IS propaganda, that reinforced this message for women to be able to fight on the front lines. However, this is still heavily caveated, and it still shows that men are prioritised to fight. Children have been engaged in training camps from the age of 5, and we've seen children as young as 5 also participating as executioners and spies, as well as frontline combatants. And they have also been promoted to be suicide operatives.
Well, there's plenty more to find out, isn't there, which is a bit of an understatement. But thank you, Gina, for talking to us. I'll have to leave it there. Gina Vale, Research Fellow at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College in London, co-author of that report that we've been talking about.